You're listening to the Rewilding Earth podcast. The Rewilding Earth podcast is supported by businesses such as Patagonia, Catula, and Biohabitats, as well as the Whedon Foundation and listeners like you. If you love the work that the Rewilding Institute is doing, please consider donating at rewilding.org. And be sure to sign up for our weekly newsletter while you're there. For over 40 years, Dr. John Laundré has studied predators and their prey in the western U.S. and northern Mexico. He's conducted one of the longest studies of cougar ecology and behavior to date and has published over 80 scientific articles on his work. He's the originator of the concept of the landscape of fear that proposed that fear of prey for their predators drives many, if not all, ecological processes. An important aspect of this concept is that predators become instrumental in maintaining the balance between prey species and their habitat, not so much by killing their prey, but by affecting how they use the landscape. John's book, Phantoms of the Prairie, The Return of Cougars to the Midwest, looks at the phenomenon of cougars actually moving back into the Great Plains region of the U.S. John's teaching at Western Oregon University, and he serves on the board of Cougar Rewilding Foundation, whose goal is the eventual reestablishment of viable cougar populations in the eastern U.S. What's taking so long? What are the big barriers today to cougars in the Adirondacks?
Well, the main reason, I think, is because of the agencies. They don't really want them back. Their official status is we don't have anything planned in the immediate future. And that stems from their bias toward hunting rather than to what the people want. And so what we find is that even though there's a lot of support to bring cougars back to the east and specifically to the Adirondacks, these agencies really are dragging their feet on it. They bring up a lot of different excuses. They bring up reasons that the various reasons that they shouldn't bring them back.
It seems to be generational because there's enough time has passed that different leaders and agencies have come and gone. Whole staffs have probably changed over in the last 30 years. And I don't know, it's just weird for it to hang around generationally like that when it seems like people are more interested in cougars than they ever have been.
Yeah, it takes a long period of time for an agency, a game agency, to actually change its ways, because they, through a variety of different methods, they really do maintain the status quo over generations. We have specific colleges and universities that put out wildlife managers, which primarily are anti-predator and prefer the game species that hunters can shoot. And they're the ones most likely to be hired by these agencies. And so the people who actually, even though like the New York agency does have an active kind of conservation aspect to it, that doesn't blend with the hunting aspect of it. So that the people who are making decisions regarding whether we bring cougars back are the same people who are making decisions about wildlife. They're not the same people who are working with bald eagle recovery or some other endangered species that hunters don't really care about. And so, what we find is that because of this, you get this generational lag time. It takes a long time, and if you don't restructure the whole agency itself, it can persist for generations because of that. It's as these people are retired, they are replaced by people who are think in the same manner. There are a few game agencies that could call themselves wildlife agencies, but most of them are still game agencies, and their either expressed or unexpressed mission is to provide more game in the bag for the hunters, and anything that gets in the way of that, predators, is something that they don't want to deal with. And specifically in the East, they don't want to bring back.
Well, I'm dissatisfied with the progress. We need to speed it up. So what can we do today? I mean, it seems like the people don't worry too much about it. I mean, talk about the surveys and the things that you know about the attitude of non-hunters toward cougars in the east?
In my upcoming book, I address three different what I call landscapes. One is what we call the biological landscape. That is, could the East in general support cougars? And indeed, it can. I mean, it's just having worked with cougars in the West for many years, and seeing where they can live. You look at the East and you go, well, they can live anywhere they want. And so the biological landscape is very favorable, even though there was a study early on in the Adirondacks, for example, where the fellow concluded there wasn't much habitat, but he was basing it upon the then prevalent idea that cougars were a species of wilderness. They had to have wilderness where very little people. He came to that conclusion because back in the 60s and 70s, he went out to the West, and of course in the West at that time, the only place you could find them were in the more remote areas because they'd been killed off. And so he brought that idea back to the East and made his conclusions. We now know they can live pretty much anywhere they want. And so indeed, the biological landscape in the East is quite favorable. In my book, I go through and look at the whole region in general, and then also each of the different states in terms of just where, if that was the only landscape we were considering, that could be a lot of places. The next landscape to look at is the social landscape that I call the social landscape, and that's the people's attitude. Are the people favorable toward cougars or not? And because one of the things that's constantly brought up is, we need more surveys to see what people will think. We need to go carefully. And I go, we don't need any more surveys. I mean, there's a publication that came out toward the first part of the century that was an annotated list, a bibliography of all of the different surveys that had been done up to that time. And there was 50 of them. And most of those were favorable, including, surprisingly, some of the surveys of ranchers and hunters, where you would expect them to be almost 100% against, but they're not. They're 30, 40 consistently percent of them are favorable to the idea. After that, since 2000, there's been at least another 30 or so surveys. So we have survey after survey after survey, all demonstrating a high support, as much as 70% or more, for the return of cougars to the East. And that brings us to the third landscape, and that's what I call the political landscape. In the political landscape, I address the agencies. These are the game agencies, the hunter agencies that exist in each state, supposedly to take care of, to manage our wildlife for all of us. However, they got their start primarily by trying to keep people from overkilling wildlife back in the 1800s and early 1900s. They were mandated to take care of wildlife for everyone, but they were set up basically to provide more game for hunters. And of course, anything that interferes with that, poaching, for example, so game wardens, I forget what conservation officers, I think they call them now, were a big part of the initial organization, and still are. Turns out poaching is still a big factor, or that these conservation hunters can't seem to control their own kind, and so conservation officers, the poaching aspect of these game agencies is still a big budget item. The other big area is predators. They're constantly trying to demonstrate that if we reduce the predators, we have more wildlife, more huntable wildlife in terms of deer, elk, and whatever. It goes all the way down to pheasants and all kinds of different birds that are hunted. And those decisions are made by the game agencies. And so that's a third level that one has to consider when we look at these different landscapes that you have to superimpose on each other to see where cougars could live in the East. And when you put that last layer on, it's a big no. They don't want them back. They will use whatever means they can to drag their feet to bring them back. This is why they say there's no immediate plans to bring them back. They don't want them back because the hunters don't want them back.
Listeners of the Rewilding Earth podcast, we'll start to see a pattern forming here. In the last several episodes, we've talked about a whole bunch of different issues. And the one thing that ties them all together is these hunting agencies. I like that you call them that. You might as well, since the commissioner has to be a hunter to even be considered for the position. Well, then you're a hunting agency, and you're not really acting on behalf of the benefit and of all the people. So, and it's really only a fraction of the hunting community that's actually so it's a vocal minority of a minority because most people are not hunters.
We really need to put some numbers on these so that we appreciate just how biased all of this is. Is that we have this agency that over 90% of its actions are to benefit. I think nationally now it's 4% of the population, and you go, oh, that's not quite right. And so it frustrates a lot of people. People have tried to work with these agencies only to find that they will let you speak, but they won't listen. They will tend to try to minimize what you say. They will even as much as belittle what you say. They'll marginalize all of these arguments that are scientifically based, but they'll marginalize them all just so that they don't have to deal with them. They will even recognize some of the science, but once they've recognized some of that science, there's a big but.
You're listening to the Rewilding Earth podcast. Did you know we also publish insightful and inspirational content from leading rewilding scholars, poets, artists, and organizers from around the world? You can visit rewilding.org and sign up for our weekly digest to receive brilliant, fresh insights on everything rewilding. You'll find over a decade of articles and news from the front lines of wildlands protection and all kinds of restoration efforts. Check us out at rewilding.org, and don't forget to share it with friends. You know, everybody who's a constituent is going to raise their voice, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's just that it seems that the agencies are set up so that the only voices are heard are amplifying voices that are an extreme minority of the population, as we said earlier. But you know, it's we usually stop the discussion there with, but how do you change things? And we've talked to some people in the past who have said, I won't try. I'll say, we need to get more involved with this. And my naive attempt to just get to the bottom of it. And I think a lot of people would actually say that, well, why aren't we more involved? Why aren't there more biologists? Why aren't there more scientists on these commissions? And it's been explained thoroughly to me now that it's a fiefdom. And it's very well protected. And they allow people like you to come in and make public statements to pretend as though they're open, but they're not listening, like you said. They're not there to listen. They just want everybody to pretend like they're open. Look, we're listening to this other voice, a dissenting voice on our major opinion. And do you feel those same frustrations where it's not at all a part of, you know, it's not like I could go and try to get on one of these commissions myself. It's not open like that.
Most of them are appointed positions, appointed by the governor. Governors where you have that are more influenced by the hunting industry, obviously would be more likely to appoint people who are more conducive to the hunting industry or the livestock industry. They rarely have people who are there to represent the general public because they don't think that the general public is
knows
wise enough, I guess, to make those decisions, which they are. I mean, they're more. Most people in the general public know more about wildlife than most hunters do. Here in Oregon, the governor, who should know better because he's not a hunter, she tried to appoint a guy that was a trophy hunter, and I remember that she got slammed for it, and his name was withdrawn. But you go, well, why did she even try to do that when we know that the public, that's one of the biggest concerns that the public has relative to the management of wildlife, and that's just killing animals just as a trophy. The hunting industry continues to point to their surveys that indicate that the general public still widely supports hunting for food. Then they kind of mumble and kind of quickly step over those percentages as they precipitously drop in support of other reasons for killing wildlife. And one of the lowest ones in approval is trophy hunting, because
Yeah.
it violates not only what we perceive as being sane, but also it violates one of their principal, supposedly guiding tenets from the North American model of wildlife conservation, and that is the frivolous killing of wildlife. How much more frivolous can you get to just kill an animal just to say that you've done it, to put its head up on the wall? But these are the types of things that persist. One of the reasons they throw up relative to why they don't need to think about reintroducing cougars at this moment is because they hold that pipe dream of recolonization, that somehow these animals are going to move from the west to the east. This has been a common theme that's been even pushed by some of the scientists based upon the number of animals that have been found basically dead as they tried to cross the east or the Great Plains, and or they showed up dead in the east, like the famous Connecticut cougar. It is indeed a pipe dream. It's something that most of these animals are males, and so we're looking at decades, if not decades, of anything possible could happen, and that just delays it even more.
Yeah.
And that's what these agencies want. They want an excuse not to do anything. And say, oh, well, they're dangerous, and also, but they're coming, and if they come on their own, well, that's fine. It takes us off the hook.
I mean, you put to bed the idea that we need another survey and that the public is not amenable to the idea of cougars in the East, all of that. And we have a pretty experienced listener base here. They don't need to hear another thing about how, I was tempted to ask you, why would a cougar want to live in the East? And then I saw your map and I'm like, this has been covered before. This is very, very well researched. I saw how you put the buffers of all of the different disturbances and prove that cougars can live within those zones. And you look at that map of the Adirondacks and you're like, yeah, with that, you can see cougars there, a very healthy population of cougars there. We could talk about that today, but what I think all of this is pointing to is this agency thing. Like that we started with it's just that way and it's generational. I wanted to know why it was so locked down. Why couldn't a new commissioner come in, a younger person and all that, and you put that to bed? You said it's a generational thing. It really feels locked in. What I think listeners are getting here is over the last several podcasts, we keep bringing up these agencies and our frustration. And I wonder what you might say to what's the final thing it's going to take. We've developed it's coast to coast. It's established everywhere in the same way. We always hear it's the hunters. It's a really tiny vocal minority. You say it's the number is 4% of the population benefits from the decisions that these commissions make. That these are really hunting organizations, and okay, so we've heard a lot about that. What is your idea about what it's going to take to actually materially, systemically change that?
Two things. The first is we do really need to look at how these agencies are financed. All the data indicate that people who don't hunt, people specifically what we call wildlife watchers, contribute a tremendous amount of economic incentive or gains to from their activity, much more than hunters do.
Mm-hmm.
But unfortunately, very little of that money actually reaches agencies where to pay salaries and turn the lights on. And so what we need to do is to somehow change that so that a majority of the funding comes basically from the general fund, because in a lot of states, the majority of the funding for wildlife still comes from hunter licenses. And this is why they're complaining. They're saying, oh, there's fewer hunters, and so we have less for wildlife. What they're saying basically is not they don't have less for wildlife; they have less for game species, and that's what has them worried. How are they going to meet the needs of their hunter clientele if their hunter clientele is getting smaller? And some of them are very, very reluctant to accept general fund money. The state of Idaho proudly brags that not $1 of the general fund goes toward their agency. The reason they say that that's the case is because it keeps them pure. That is, they're not controlled by the politics of the state. But
Which is exactly what we want.
They have no problem. Yeah, they have no problem being controlled by the politics of the hunters, and the politics of the hunters causes them to do things that are, ecologically unsustainable. And so it varies across the states, but there's still quite a few states. All the states still have a majority of the money that they use for wildlife coming from these hunting license fees. If you follow the trail, you may see that an agency gets a certain percent of general funds, but it goes toward things that aren't related specifically to wildlife management. They've encapsulated the money from hunters for a very specific reason: management of game species, which of course they include in that a lot of wildlife species that we as the public would consider not to be a game species. Most of what they call the vermin species that they just kill on sight for the fun of it.
Yeah.
And so we need to change that. Every state should be using general funds, and when I refer to it as a reinvestment in wildlife, because of all of the tremendous amount of money that wildlife watching generates in each state in terms of taxes, some of those taxes should be reinvested in the programs that bring in the money. It's like the lottery. Well, here what we find is that the states are getting a tremendous amount of money, millions of dollars, I think billions on the national level, millions of dollars from wildlife activities, and not paying a dime back. What they need to decide is that we need to dedicate a certain amount of that money. I looked at it, again, I worked this out in my book, the Guardians of the Forest, bringing cougars and wolves back to the east. I look at that and saying, well, what would be a reasonable amount of money to reinvest? And I was, from other types of analyses, I just picked 15%, 15% reinvestment, and that would tremendously increase the budget of these agencies for paying salaries for turning the lights on. And the more salaries that you pay for wildlife that comes from the general fund, the larger that percentage of people who deal with wildlife represent the people and not just the hunter. My ideal vision of a state wildlife agency is where the hunting department has the corner office, and all the rest of the building is run by is occupied by the people who are actually working with wildlife relative to how people want them to work with wildlife. As we know, money talks. I mean, that's the hunters use. They say, we pay, we say. Okay, well, that's how we need to pay. They talk about schemes. People say, well, we need to, we if we want to have a voice, we need to pay. We are paying. It's just that they're not taking our money and using it for the right thing. The other is we really need a restructuring of the departments themselves. There are some that are just, so archaic that they are still fish and game. And so you have a game department and that's it. There are some that call themselves wildlife, but they are primarily, it was a name change only. For example, in California, which is one of the more better states, the agency changed its name from Fish and Game Division of Wildlife, but the commission didn't. It's still the Fish and Game Commission. And well, that says a lot.
I'm sort of scared of your answer to this next question, but is there a federal solution or a piece of a solution here, or is this really a state-by-state effort like Project Coyote is taking on right now, getting rid of working state by state for the killing contest for coyotes? I mean, is it really going to have to be a campaign like that, or is there any part of this a federal solution where we could get something worked into a bill to support what you're talking about, this real systemic change?
There is a bill in front of Congress that is looking at ways to add additional funding to wildlife or to these wildlife agencies, kind of like the Pittman-Roberts money, but it comes from a different source. And initially, this was done by the supposedly blue ribbon panel that had several choices. And the first choice they had was to use oil and gas excise tax money, which was a horrible idea. And people pointed it out to them. But the latest bill supposedly would be just what I mentioned, would be reinvesting a certain amount of the money that on a national level that wildlife watchers contribute to the federal budget, and so it come from the general fund of the federal budget. If this should be passed, then automatically there's going to be a big chunk of money that's going to be going to the states, specifically for a variety of activities. One is to fund all these species action plans that they were supposed to develop relative to the federal level. So we might see some movement in that direction, but it depends upon what species that the states deemed as being worthwhile to consider, and not surprisingly, cougars aren't on very many of those lists.
Thinking about all the different options that I could come up with and that I've heard other guests talk about, I'm looking for a unifying one thread, one piece of leverage that kind of kicks it all off. And it actually doesn't sound as daunting to get people to put things like cougars on the species action plan list or the list of priorities when money is coming from the Fed that backs that up, because money makes everything possible. Money solves all problems in this situation, and they then have to contend with the public outcry that cougars need to be, in this example, taken seriously and get put on those lists for species action plans. I feel like I'm finally hearing what that leverage point, that one thread that connects all of these things together, might be.
The important point is not so much that we need to pay, but we need to say. This is where, indeed, we do need involvement. We do need people pressuring these agencies, even at the state at the level they are now, pressuring these agencies to get off their butts and do something.
Yeah. Well, we've been doing that without money all this time, and we've gotten this far. But if feds are dumping money into it, it might just be the catalyst that we needed, because we've been active at the state level as much as anybody could. Well, as much as we have. It doesn't matter whether we've done a gargantuan collective amount of organizing and outcry. To date, it's only amounted to what we have now, which is a dire situation. It's still not close to right. And I'm looking for that thread, and I think it feels hopeful what you're saying. It might be a little bit more than just a ray of hope, because we've talked about everything else, and most of the time people walk away with scratching their heads going, I don't know when this is going to change. I don't know how you breed this out of the program.
Missouri's been a prime example of just taking a very small percentage of the sales tax. I think 1/8 of a percent, and dedicated toward their wildlife department. They've got more money than they know what to do with. Unfortunately, they don't. There's still a heavy hunting influence on how some of that money is spent. You still have to have the people saying, well, okay, we do pay. Now we want to say, and what we want is this, and not be passive about it and wait until the agency decides to do something. We need to be telling these agencies what to do.
Well, just so everybody knows, if you're new to rewilding or you're new to this topic, welcome. We've been talking about this for many, many years, decades. And today you're hearing about the problems. Now, this might not be as exciting as talking about the first cougar, touching down in the Adirondacks today. But that will only come, I think, because of what we talked about today, the issues that you're bringing up here and the solutions. While Missouri might not be getting it right, they sure do get brought up an awful lot on the Rewilding podcast when people point to examples of allocation of funds and how powerful that is in backing up our on-the-ground work, where we can then phone in and we can go to public hearings and we can comment and have that backing us up. I think is a direct line to seeing cougars hit the ground in the Adirondacks and possibly someday even in the Smokies. You've mentioned that before.
The best places are the public lands, and there's still lots of them across the east. There's still some nice sizable ones. These would be the places where we could reintroduce cougars, and from there, then they could move into some of these other areas and basically fill out that biological landscape as much as we would basically socially let them. And so that's why one of the conclusions I've drawn in my book is that why should we care what the hunters say? First of all, they have a perverted sense of how nature works. It's so egocentric that it has to revolve around them. And second of all, that leads to forcing the agencies to take non-ecological, scientifically based actions, which then exacerbates the problem. And they're only 5% or 4% of us. Why should we even consider them? But we do. If bringing back wolves and cougars to the east bring deer numbers back to a sensible level that can be sustained over time, hunters will have a better opportunity to hunt deer in the future than what they've created now in terms of an excess population that's prone to massive die-offs because of habitat destruction and also disease.
I think that's a really good point. Why should we care what hunters think?
Mm-hmm.
Guardians of the forest, returning wolves and pumas to the east. When can we expect to get our hands on this?
I'm almost done with it. I'd say 95% done with it. So I'm hoping sometime this year I'll actually finish it. I'm right now revising some of the chapters.
If you want to get a little taste of it, though, John did make a contribution to us last year at rewilding.org. If you just put in Guardians of the Forest in the search at rewilding.org, you will find his article, which is sort of like an excerpt, right, from the forthcoming book. So if you guys want a taste of it sooner than later, you can go there and read about it there. John, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. I feel like parts of the conversation are repeats of the things that we lament as conservationists a lot about state agencies and federal agencies and this attitude toward wildlife, the current North American model of management. But I feel like we made some breakthroughs today, too. And I would like to talk a little bit more about that on the page. So wherever you're listening to this, we'll put more resources here from John and myself to make sure that you get the best picture of this situation. And you can also take some action, listeners, so that we're always moving toward this goal of cougars in the east and wolves. We didn't even get to talk about wolves, but we have talked about it before. And we've got to have you back on. Certainly when the book is out, we're going to have you back on so you can talk about more of these issues with us. Thank you, John.
Oh, thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Rewilding Earth podcast. We do what we do because of you. This podcast is supported by listeners like you who long to live in a wilder world. Please consider donating at rewilding.org and subscribe to our weekly news and article digest while you're there. To go the extra mile, you can follow and share Rewilding Earth on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. Bonus points for sharing this podcast with your friends. To listen to past episodes, go to rewilding.org/pod. That's rewilding.org/pod.